The first snowfall of December settled like a hush over Willow Creek, soft as a memory and cold as regret. Smoke wove upward from a few lonely chimneys, dissolving into a sky the color of tarnished pewter. The town's main street was quiet, boots too frozen to wander without purpose, and horses stood steaming behind weathered hitching posts. The world felt slowed, wrapped in a winter that seemed determined to test every beating heart that tried to survive it. Betty Mayfield lived on the edge of that settlement, in a small log cabin built by hands that no longer lived to feel its warmth. Her late husband James had earned calluses and scars while shaping every beam, but death stole him during a brutal storm the previous year when he attempted to haul medical supplies from a distant town. He left behind a cabin, a few tools, and a world that now felt too large for one woman. Betty learned to tend chickens, repair fences, barter woolen mittens she knitted, and split wood in smaller pieces that her slender arms could manage. She survived because she refused to let grief take everything winter had not already claimed. Neighbors admired her resolve, though admiration was rarely spoken aloud. In a small settlement, young widows attracted whispers more easily than compassion. The moral eyes of the town studied her, always searching for movement that might confirm suspicion. The widow should stay reserved, quiet, loyal to a ghost. She should not laugh too freely or greet a stranger with warmth. Betty understood the rules but did not have the energy to shape her life around them. Grief had carved away her vanity. The opinions of people who never helped her stack a single log of firewood no longer held power over her daily choices. Inside her cabin, the winter felt like a presence, not a season. A damp chill crept through the seams of the walls and settled beneath quilts. Betty kept the fire alive with the devotion one might offer an aging parent. Every log burned became a promise that daylight would come again. Some nights she whispered to herself simply to hear another human voice. Loneliness was not sharp or sudden. It was slow, a weight that settled quietly into her bones. Rumors drifted into Willow Creek the way ravens glide over treetops. Travelers spoke of a man who lived between tribal and settler lands, neither claiming allegiance nor seeking trouble. They described him as enormous, broad-shouldered, with muscles cut like the grain of ancient oak. His presence carried both mystery and awe. Miners claimed they glimpsed him shirtless in the dead of winter, a fur cloak draped across one arm, gripping axes with easy strength. Few knew his name, though some whispered it like a prayer. Nakoa Blackbird. Betty heard these stories while trading knitted scarves at the mercantile. She listened silently, her hands hidden in wool gloves she made herself. The men spoke of Nakoa as if he were a legend carved from the mountains, not flesh and blood. The older miners, hardened by frostbite and disappointment, spoke with reverence. They described a man who walked through storm winds without flinching, who left footprints larger than any settler had seen. No one could explain where he lived, how he hunted, or why he appeared only when winter pressed hardest. Betty wondered if loneliness recognized its own kind. Perhaps Nakoa Blackbird chose a life where judgment could not reach him, where no one measured him by the color of his skin or the history of his ancestors. She did not fear him. She feared only the emptiness that echoed through her cabin long after the fire died. Her days passed in quiet rhythms. She hauled water from the frozen creek, her breath turning to misty ribbons. She fed the hens, brushed frost from their feathers, and collected eggs that felt like fragile gifts in a world that sometimes forgot softness existed. Each task reminded her she could endure more than she once believed possible. Some nights, she stood outside under the stars wrapped in a wool shawl, listening to the wind move through the pines. The forest felt like a cathedral, and she sensed that somewhere deeper within the trees walked a man who understood silence the way she did. One morning, after a night of heavy snowfall, Betty opened her door and found fresh-cut firewood stacked neatly beside her porch. The logs were thick, meticulously split, and arranged in a perfect line. She scanned the yard, sure she would see tracks leading away, but the wind had erased every sign. The work was strong, efficient, and kind. James could never split wood this cleanly, even on his strongest days. Whoever had done it was impossibly skilled. Betty's heart fluttered with confusion and gratitude. She had not asked for help. She could not imagine who would silently arrive before dawn to offer such a gift. Townsfolk did not sneak into another person's yard without expecting thanks or gossip. Settlers were proud. Every act of kindness became a performance. This had no performance. No one knocked on her door. No one waited for praise. Whoever brought the wood wanted nothing. Betty warmed her hands by the fire and studied the logs again, running her fingers over the smooth edges. She felt the presence of a stranger in them, a strength that belonged to someone who did not fear winter's demands. Something inside her whispered a name she had not spoken aloud. Nakoa. She could not explain why she felt so certain. She only knew that no miner in Willow Creek possessed the skill or humility to offer such labor quietly. The following week brought more storms. Each morning, more wood waited outside her door. Betty began to anticipate it, not greedily, but with a sense of companionship. Winter no longer felt like a battle she fought alone. She sensed a soul somewhere near, watching without needing to be seen, protecting without claiming ownership. It humbled her. Yet small towns cling to suspicion more tightly than gratitude. One afternoon, while trading flour at the mercantile, Betty overheard voices rising behind her. A young couple whispered that someone had spotted large footprints near her cabin. Others insisted she entertained a dangerous visitor. Their tones sharpened, fueled by fear disguised as morality. Betty stood still, feeling heat crawl into her cheeks, though she had done nothing except survive the cold. She returned home at dusk, carrying dried beans and candles. The light outside faded into lavender blue, and smoke drifted from her chimney, like a gentle hand waving her back inside. She paused at the woodpile once more, running a palm along its sturdy surface, comforted by its reliability. Then she noticed something new. A small strip of fur caught beneath the top log, as if torn from a cloak by accident. The fur was thick, silvery, far too wild to belong to livestock or any settler coat. Betty lifted the fur and pressed it between her fingers. A quiet certainty settled through her like warm honey. She was no longer alone in the wilderness. Someone watched the cabin with a protector's patience. The winter had delivered more than storms this year. It had delivered a mystery standing just beyond the trees. And Betty sensed that her life was already shifting toward a story no one in Willow Creek was ready to believe. The storm arrived without warning, swelling from a distant gray horizon like a herd of wild horses charging through the canyons. The wind roared down the valley, rattling window panes and shaking pine branches, until powdery snow billowed into the air like breath from a ghost. Betty stood at her kitchen window, watching the sky transform into a swirling white curtain that erased every familiar landmark. The day dimmed so quickly it felt like dusk had fallen hours too soon. She counted her remaining logs, worried she might run out before morning. Winter had little patience for those who miscalculated its hunger. Her hens cried from the barn, wings fluttering wildly against their cramped roosts. Betty wrapped herself in a thick wool cloak, pulled the hood tight, and stepped into the storm. The cold struck her like a slap, fierce and unrelenting. Snowflakes felt sharp, stinging her cheeks. Each step through the yard was a struggle. Wind twisted around her legs, threatening to knock her sideways. She kept going, boots sinking deep into drifts that seemed to rise faster than she could lift her feet. The barn door hung loose, banging against the frame as if begging for rescue. Betty reached it and slipped her frozen hands around the latch. The metal burned her palms, but she forced it shut and dropped the heavy crossbar into place. The hens quieted, comforted by her presence. Betty whispered a soft promise before turning to go back, though the path was already vanishing beneath blowing snow. The wind changed direction, slamming against her cloak and dragging her sideways. The storm had grown angry, ravenous. She could barely see her cabin's warm glow through the blizzard. Her breath shortened, turning shallow and frantic. She pressed forward, leaning her body into the wind the way sailors lean into thick ropes on a ship. Her foot struck uneven ground and she fell, ankle twisting beneath her. Pain shot up her leg like fire beneath ice. Betty tried to stand but her body betrayed her, unable to bear weight. Snow gathered around her instantly, creeping through fabric seams and numbing her skin. She crawled a few feet, but exhaustion swallowed her strength. Her hands trembled violently from cold. She whispered James's name not as a call for rescue, but as a quiet memory. The world blurred, and she tasted fear as sharp as salt. Something moved behind her, silent as a shadow breaking free from the forest. She could not turn her head fully, yet she sensed a presence, large, steady, calm. A shape emerged through gusts of wind as if sculpted from winter itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick fur cloak. The man kneeled beside her, and even through the storm Betty felt heat radiating from him like a living hearth. Strong hands slipped beneath her arms and lifted her without effort. Her frozen breath escaped in a weak gasp as he cradled her against his chest. His skin felt impossibly warm despite the temperature. He did not speak. He carried her fluidly through rising snow, navigating the storm like one who understood every mood winter possessed. Betty buried her face against the fur of his shoulder, because the wind felt like knives against exposed skin. The cabin door swung open, though neither of them had touched it yet. The storm had loosened its latch earlier. The man kicked it shut after stepping inside, immediately lowering Betty onto her small wooden bed. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. He knelt beside the hearth, arranging dry kindling and wood with movements both practiced and unhurried. When he blew onto the spark, the flame leaped upward as if eager to serve him. The room warmed slowly, the firelight dancing across his sculpted shoulders. Betty clutched a blanket and tried to speak, but her voice fractured. The man returned to her side and placed a fur beneath her injured ankle. His fingers pressed gently along the joint, testing for swelling or breakage. His touch held neither hesitation nor possession, only skill and quiet respect. He wrapped her foot with fabric torn from a strip of his cloak, binding it snugly, a gesture more intimate than any word he could have spoken. Steam rose from the simmering pot he placed above the fire, using vegetables and dried venison from her pantry. He worked without rifling through anything he did not need, every action clean and considerate. Betty watched him through damp eyelashes, overcome by disbelief. A stranger had carried her through a storm without complaint, warmed her with his strength, tended her wounded foot, and cooked supper as if it were the simplest thing a man could do. When she finally found her voice, it emerged as a whisper. She asked why he came. The man lifted his gaze, eyes dark as river stones and calm as dusk. He spoke with measured gentleness, his tone deep enough to feel rather than only hear. "You fell." The wind called. I listened. Betty absorbed the words as if they were pieces of a language she once knew but had forgotten. She asked his name, though she already suspected. "Nakoa," he replied, returning his focus to stirring the pot. Outside, the storm hammered the roof with unrelenting rage, yet the cabin felt safe, every flicker of fire promising survival. Steam curled upward from the finished soup. Nakoa set a bowl into Betty's hands and watched until she swallowed the first spoonful. Heat traveled from her lips into her chest, dissolving the cold that clung stubbornly to her lungs. She felt the soup anchor her spirit. He said nothing while she ate, respecting the weight of silence between strangers who suddenly shared a room like old companions. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating snowflakes as large as petals. The cabin shuddered with each gust, boards groaning beneath winter's assault. Nakoa rose occasionally to fortify the door with a log and wedge the windows tighter, but he never drifted far. His presence filled the space with a steadiness Betty could not remember feeling, even when her husband lived. James had been kind, yet he often feared what Betty learned to endure. Nakoa seemed to walk into hardship the way others walk toward a warm meal. She thanked him when the bowl emptied, emotion thickening her voice. Gratitude felt too small a word. He nodded once, neither dismissive nor proud. His eyes held the patience of a man shaped by solitude rather than bitterness. Betty studied him closely in the glow of the flames. His arms bore scars, thin lines of long-forgotten battles, weathered rather than violent. His hair fell to his shoulders, black as the mouth of a mine, gleaming wherever light touched it. He resembled the stories Betty heard in the mercantile, yet the man before her felt more human than myth. As hours passed, the cabin transformed from a place of isolation into a haven for two souls who understood survival beyond the surface. Betty drifted toward sleep, her eyelids heavy from warmth, safety, and exhaustion. She fought drowsiness, unwilling to surrender this strange peace. When her breath steadied, Nakoa rose to check the door again, and returned with more wood he had split earlier. He stacked it carefully beside the hearth, quietly offering what settlers rarely did: protection without the expectation of praise. Outside, the storm howled in wild, violent spirals, yet Betty no longer feared the night. Her body ached, but her heart felt oddly full. She stared through half-lidded eyes at the man who sat across from her, silhouetted by the fire. His stillness spoke louder than conversation ever could. For the first time since James died, she sensed that another presence might understand loss not as tragedy, but as part of the earth's ancient rhythm. Before she fell asleep, she whispered thank you again, softer than a sigh. Nakoa did not look up, yet he answered with a quiet truth carried on a breath. Winter watches those who are alone. I do the same. Betty drifted into dreams beneath that promise, unaware that outside the window, the storm no longer frightened her because something larger than fear had stepped into her life. By morning, Willow Creek would awaken to the news that someone saw a giant man carrying a pale woman through the blizzard. Rumors would sharpen, and judgment would follow like wolves on a trail. But for now, the cabin held only warmth, and Betty slept with a certainty she could not yet explain. Her isolation had been broken not by chance, but by a whisper carried through snow. The wind slowed near sunrise, and silence returned to the valley. Yet before dawn fully claimed the sky, Nakoa rose and disappeared into the forest without leaving a single footprint behind, as if winter itself erased his presence to keep a secret no one in town would understand. Winter softened its temper after the storm, leaving pale mornings wrapped in misty quiet. When Betty awoke, she half expected to find the cabin empty and untouched, as if Nakoa had never entered her life. Yet the wood stacked neatly near the hearth reminded her that kindness sometimes arrived like a silent messenger, leaving warmth without seeking gratitude. She moved carefully on her injured ankle, each step reminding her that fate could shift in a single gust of wind. Though Nakoa vanished before sunrise, Betty sensed he had not gone far. The snow outside glimmered beneath afternoon light, and the forest appeared unusually still, as if it waited for something to unfold. Her days turned gentle again. She returned to caring for the chickens, mending torn mittens, and keeping the cabin swept and orderly. Each small task felt steadier than before, as if the air itself carried reassurance. Yet she found herself glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see a familiar silhouette. She never admitted this longing aloud, even in prayer, but her heart seemed to lean toward the woods the way flowers lean toward hidden sun. Every evening she lit the fire early, allowing the glow to reach through the windows as though inviting a wandering soul to rest. She told herself she admired Nakoa's skill and strength, nothing more. But the truth settled deeper than admiration. His presence had unlocked something in her she thought grief had sealed forever. The desire to be seen, understood, not merely endured. Nakoa began appearing more regularly, never with grand entrance or explanation. Sometimes she found him repairing the barn roof in silence, his broad shoulders glistening with melted snow, muscles moving with rhythmic precision. Other times, he chopped wood behind the cabin, splitting logs cleanly with motions that looked more like grace than labor. Betty offered him food when midday sun grew bright enough to warm the yard. He accepted her hospitality with quiet dignity, sitting a respectful distance away, as if careful not to impose upon her solitude. Their conversations were sparse, yet communication traveled beneath the surface like an underground spring. When he lifted a heavy beam, she sensed his history. When she prepared soup, he sensed her loneliness. On one crisp morning, Betty stepped outside barefoot, curious about a trick Nakoa had mentioned while tending her ankle. He told her briefly that the body knows how to endure the cold if the spirit steadies itself first. She pressed her feet into the snow, expecting to wince, but a strange stillness washed through her limbs. For a few breaths, the cold felt less like punishment and more like clarity. Betty laughed softly, astonished. Nakoa stood nearby, arms crossed, amused by her triumph. When she retreated inside and poured herself a mug of warm water, she glanced back through the window and found him studying the horizon, expression unreadable. She wondered whether he had once taught a child something similar, or shared this ritual with a mother or sister long before Willow Creek existed. The rhythm of their companionship grew unhurried, like two streams finding a shared path. Neither intruded upon the other's wounds. When Betty stitched a quilt by the fire, Nakoa carved wooden traps or sharpened tools, offering occasional glances that felt like small acknowledgments. When he lifted heavy sacks of grain for her, She thanked him not with fluttering gratitude, but with a steadiness he seemed to recognize. Their silence was not awkward, it felt earned. Betty began to understand that some souls speak most honestly without words. Despite the peace surrounding her cabin, the rest of Willow Creek did not remain still. Townsfolk visited the mercantile more frequently during the cold months, eager for news and distraction. Betty felt eyes follow her each time she entered. Whispers thickened the air like smoke. A woman smirked behind a bolt of fabric, insisting she saw footprints circling Betty's property. A miner claimed that a warrior twice the size of an ordinary man helped her in the storm. Others exchanged glances soaked in judgment, assuming impropriety without evidence. Betty stood straight, refusing to shrink beneath their voices. She bought flour, candles, and oats, then returned home, unwilling to let rumor poison the refuge she nurtured within those wooden walls. Abner Crow, the elderly blacksmith, approached her one evening while she inspected lantern oil. His beard was frosted from hammering metal in the cold. He spoke with genuine concern rather than gossip, warning her that neighbors feared what they did not understand. Betty thanked him for his kindness, explaining only that winter was easier when no one faced it alone. Abner nodded, admitting that company, especially quiet company, could save more lives than firewood. He did not ask questions. He did not condemn her. Betty left the store feeling both grateful and unsettled. Concern from one friend often meant hostility from others. At home, the cabin welcomed her like an old companion. Nakoa was already there, mending the fence near the barn with a mallet and sturdy nails. She offered him supper, and he accepted, sitting near the crackling hearth while shadows flickered along the walls. Betty watched the way his hands moved, strong, steady, gentle as a craftsman shaping something sacred. She could almost imagine a life where days unfolded quietly, every burden shared, every silence comfortable. The thought warmed her even more than the fire, though she tried not to dwell on it. Love had once come with vows and expectations, and she was not ready to invite that kind of weight again. Yet her heart did not tremble with fear whenever she sensed Nakoa near. It settled, as though remembering a home it had never known. The trouble arrived as winter deepened. A young couple riding past her cabin spotted Nakoa stacking wood behind the house. Whispering voices galloped toward town before nightfall. By morning, Willow Creek treated Betty with sharper glances than before, implying scandal where there was none. She felt their judgment pressing against her like icy wind. She told herself to ignore them, yet she could not dismiss the knowledge that rumor rarely stayed contained. Gossip traveled faster than snowfall, and she sensed something building in the distance, unpredictable and dangerous. One night, after Nakoa prepared to leave, Betty stood beside the porch, her lantern glowing gold against the dark. He paused near the tree line, watching her closely. Snowflakes drifted slowly downward, silent as feathers. She wanted to ask him not to go. She wanted to tell him the town had begun to circle like restless wolves. But the words lodged inside her, tangled between caution and longing. She only whispered goodnight, voice trembling with emotion she did not yet name. Nakoa lingered a moment longer, gaze steady and unreadable. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest as if swallowed by moonlit shadows. Betty remained on the porch, clutching the lantern. The wind felt colder than before, carrying the uneasy impression that winter would soon test more than her endurance. Somewhere beyond the pines, trouble gathered like approaching thunder, and she knew her quiet days were numbered. The thaw never came. Winter held the town in its grip longer than anyone predicted, and hunger sharpened tempers. Betty felt it first through a change in the air whenever she walked into Willow Creek. Fewer people greeted her, more eyes narrowed. Whispers no longer hid behind shelves or sacks of grain. They floated openly like cold smoke. She sensed that curiosity had transformed into suspicion, and suspicion had hardened into quiet hostility. She paid for her flour in strained silence, refusing to let gossip unsettle her composure. Yet she walked home with a knot in her chest, fearing that winter would not be the only season she had to survive. That afternoon a messenger arrived, sent from the town council. He sat stiffly on horseback, his breath frosting beneath a trimmed mustache. Without meeting her eyes, he informed Betty that the council wished to speak with her at first light. His tone lacked warmth, as though he believed her guilt before she even heard the accusation. Betty accepted politely, though anxiety churned within. When the horse trotted away, she leaned against the porch rail and stared at the distant snow-covered pines, hoping Nakoa would appear. She needed reassurance, even if only through a silent presence. The forest remained still, unwilling to offer comfort. She barely slept that night. Dawn approached slowly, bringing a pale gray light that felt neither welcoming nor kind. Betty dressed in her warmest shawl, braided her hair tightly, and walked to the council building with her chin lifted. The chamber was cold, smelling of damp wood and old grievances. Men sat in a semicircle, boots muddy, hands clasped as though delivering judgment brought them righteousness. The mayor, a stern man named Virgil Harlow, cleared his throat and addressed her without ceremony. He explained that concerned citizens reported a native warrior living on her property. Betty corrected him gently, insisting no one lived with her, and no impropriety ever occurred. Virgil's eyes hardened. He claimed that winter charity could be misinterpreted, and that a young widow must consider the town's moral reputation. Betty reminded them she survived alone after her husband died, and no one offered to split wood or haul water for her. She asked why kindness from a stranger threatened them more than her suffering ever did. A murmur rippled through the room. Some councilmen shifted uncomfortably, though none defended her. Virgil's voice sharpened as he declared that the presence of a native man frightened families, especially if Betty appeared too comfortable with him. She felt the words strike like hailstones. They were less concerned with danger than with propriety, less concerned with truth than with appearances. Virgil insisted she end all association with the man or risk eviction from her cabin, a structure legally tied to town land. Betty swallowed hard, tasting humiliation. She calmly explained that Nakoa had saved her life during a blizzard, tended her injuries, and asked for nothing. She reminded them that survival did not follow etiquette, and neither did gratitude. Her voice trembled but did not break. She expected them to soften. Instead, Virgil raised his hand as if her explanation exhausted his patience. He repeated the warning. If she did not distance herself, the town would take action. Betty stood in stunned silence, realizing they cared more about rumor than the truth of her circumstances. She exited the chamber into a street where eyes waited hungrily, expecting tears, confession, or anger. Betty walked steadily toward home, refusing to give them any performance. Only when the cabin door closed behind her did she release the breath she held. A sob escaped, unplanned and sharp, like a rusted nail tearing through cloth. She felt betrayed by neighbors who once called her admirable for enduring grief. Apparently strength was applauded only when performed in isolation. Once she accepted help, they judged her like a scandal. Betty spent the evening packing her few belongings into a trunk James once built. The act felt surreal. She touched her knitting needles, the silver hairpin her mother gifted her, and the worn blanket that still held faint traces of her husband's scent. She worked slowly, folding memories into silence. She planned to leave at dawn, traveling wherever winter might allow her passage. The thought terrified her, yet staying meant subjecting Nakoa to danger. If the town felt threatened, fear could escalate into violence. She refused to let rumor harm a man who risked his safety for her survival. She paused at the window when she heard a distant crunching of snow, steady and deliberate, as though the forest itself exhaled. Her pulse quickened. She knew the rhythm of those footsteps without seeing their owner. The doorknob rattled once, then opened with quiet certainty. Nakoa stepped inside, brushing frost from his hair and cloak. His presence filled the cabin with the same calm she had felt the night he rescued her. Yet tonight she did not feel relief, she felt dread. Nakoa studied the half-packed trunk, and the tears drying on her cheeks. His gaze darkened, not with anger but with understanding deeper than words. Betty tried to explain, though the sentences tangled. She told him the council demanded she sever ties, or they would strip her of her home. She insisted she could not harm his safety, and leaving before sunrise was the only solution. Her voice cracked with frustration. She resented a world where kindness must be hidden like contraband. Nakoa walked closer, and touched the edge of the trunk with one broad hand, then lifted his eyes toward her with quiet fierceness. Betty expected him to disappear again, to vanish before trouble reached her. Instead, he spoke with a clarity that silenced the storm of her thoughts. "Pack your things, Betty. You are mine now." The words struck like thunder in a silent canyon. She stared at him, breath unsteady, uncertain whether he meant possession or promise. His expression revealed neither dominance nor haste. Instead, she recognized protection, a deep vow carved from unspoken loyalty. He did not claim her body or reputation. He claimed responsibility for her safety, offering a life beyond judgment, beyond fear, beyond loneliness. Betty's heart raced, not from romance but from the sudden realization that escape had already been planned for her without cruelty or control. She stood frozen beneath the weight of his certainty. Leaving Willow Creek with Nakoa would change everything. She whispered that she did not know where such a path led. Nakoa stepped closer, shadows flickering across his features, voice low as winter wind. "Anywhere you are not hunted." The cabin seemed to breathe with them, walls swelling with the truth she had tried to deny. Outside, the night grew still, as if winter listened. Inside, Betty felt the first spark of a future she could not yet name, trembling like a candle flame before sunrise. The night before departure felt unreal, a quiet between storms. Betty packed the last of her belongings into 2 canvas satchels, folding her life into soft bundles without mourning what she left behind. Nakoa waited near the door, sharpening a hunting knife with slow, steady strokes, every motion calm as a heartbeat. Their silence felt comfortable, a shared acceptance that choices had already been made for them by necessity, not impulse. When dawn finally brushed a pale line across the horizon, Nakoa saddled 2 horses and left the cabin door open to the morning air. Betty stepped outside, gripping the satchels, letting the final memory of her cabin settle inside her like a fading hymn. She did not cry. A chapter had closed with dignity, not despair. They traveled deeper into the forest, hooves sinking into soft drifts. Winter sunlight shimmered through pines like scattered silver threads. Betty inhaled the crisp air and felt her fear loosen with every mile. Leaving Willow Creek no longer felt like exile but release, the first time she welcomed uncertainty instead of resisting it. Wolves howled in the distance, their voices threaded with both warning and wonder. Nakoa rode ahead, posture tall and unwavering, as though he could read every bend in the terrain without hesitation. Betty trusted his direction more than any map. Hours passed in a rhythm that soothed them both. When they reached a frozen creek, Nakoa dismounted and helped Betty cross on foot, holding her elbow not because she was weak, but because the ice could betray anyone without warning. His quiet consideration felt more protective than any vow spoken aloud. They ate jerky and dried berries beneath a cluster of snow-laden branches, the cold gentled by crackling fire. Betty watched embers glow like captured stars and realized she had not felt alone once since leaving the cabin. Solitude had once wrapped around her like a heavy coat. Now companionship felt lighter, as inevitable as breathing. By late afternoon, they reached a secluded clearing surrounded by towering spruce. A small winter lodge stood there, built with careful hands and guarded by pine shadows. Smoke drifted from its chimney, promising warmth. Nakoa opened the door without ceremony, revealing a space filled with thick furs, stocked shelves, and a stone hearth ready for fire. Betty stepped inside, marveling that solitude could be lived with intention, not abandonment. Nakoa set her satchels on a bench, and she felt a tremor in her chest, the sensation of arriving somewhere that did not demand explanations. As evening settled, he built a fire that glowed copper against the log walls. Betty sat beside the hearth with her hands extended toward the heat. Nakoa knelt to check her injured ankle, unwrapping the cloth and pressing gently along the tender bone. His touch carried reverence, not familiarity. She tried to thank him, but emotion filled her throat. He wrapped her ankle again and rested his hand briefly on her calf, offering comfort deeper than language. The lodge grew warm, and Betty's gaze drifted toward the man who had walked through judgment without flinching. She whispered that she did not understand why he helped her, when the cost could have been great. Nakoa lifted his head, eyes reflecting firelight. He told her he had watched her survive storms alone, chop wood when her hands shook, and hold grief without bitterness. He admitted that the forest whispered her name long before he approached, not because she was fragile, but because she endured without demanding saving. Betty blinked back tears, surprised that someone had studied her strength rather than her sorrow. Nakoa shifted closer, voice steady as a mountain stream. He confessed that love did not strike him like sudden fire, but grew slowly from quiet respect, from the way she placed kindness above fear, from the way she faced winter without surrender. Betty's pulse fluttered, stunned by the softness beneath his massive frame. She whispered that she feared burdening him with her presence. He answered that he felt less alone with her near, as though two hearts could share the same fire without dimming one another. Their hands touched, neither urgent nor uncertain. Two survivors, choosing belonging over secrecy. Outside, snow drifted gently, sealing the world in silence. Inside, Nakoa leaned forward and told her he wanted no possession, only partnership, a life where winter could not break them because they faced it together. Betty exhaled, every lie she once told herself dissolving like frost before sunlight. That night, as the wind circled the lodge like a guardian, Betty lay beside the fire, and finally felt what it meant to rest inside safety. She understood that the world might never approve, but their truth did not require permission. She closed her eyes, knowing the town that once judged her would search for rumors and find only absence. Winter had delivered something more enduring than survival. The beginning of a love whispered softly across miles of snow, a promise strong enough to change not just two lives but the landscape of loneliness itself.